In this lesson, we're going to see how to perform transformations in CSS3 by setting the transform property on an element. You can set the transform property to translate if you want to move the element up or down, or left or right. Or you can set the transform property to the scale function if you want to make an element bigger or smaller. Or you can set the transform property to the rotate function if you want to rotate an element clockwise or anti-clockwise. Or you can set it to a skew function if you want to skew the shape about the x-axis or the y-axis. So let's see how that works. First of all, we'll see the translations example. I'm using Komodo Edit as my editor. And first of all, let me show you how this example works. At the bottom of the document, I have a series of div elements, and each div has a separate class, and I apply a separate rule for each class. So if I go back up again, in the first example, for the first div, this is how you perform transformations at the moment in HTML5. You set these properties. MS-transform represents transformations in Internet Explorer. The MS stands for Microsoft. WebKit transform applies for WebKit-based browsers, so that's Safari or Chrome. Mozilla transform, that applies for Firefox. And O represents Opera. Okay, so at the moment, you have to set these four properties depending on which browser you're targeting, and you set it to the translate function if you want to perform a translation. And if you just specify one value, then it assumes you're just translating in the x direction to the right. If you specify a negative value, then it goes to the left. You can also specify percentages. That will translate in the positive x direction to the right by 20% of the element's size, or to the left by 20% of the element size. So if you remember what that looked like, translate to the right, to the left, by a percentage, or by a negative percentage to move it left. You can also specify two values, and that will translate 400 pixels to the right and 20 pixels down. So that's the example I have here. 400 pixels to the right, 20 pixels downwards. With the Y translation, a positive value means down, a negative value means up. There's also a function called translate X, which obviously just translates in the X direction, and translate Y, which obviously just translates in the Y direction. Okay, so that's the basic idea for how this works. Let me show you the scaling example. With the scale function, you specify a number less than 1 to make the element smaller, or more than 1 to make it larger. If you just specify one value, then the X and the Y scales are both increased by the same amount. You can scale by different amounts by giving two values. The first value in this example will double the width, and the second parameter will increase the height by 50%. There's also a scale X function, which obviously just increases the width by 50% in this example, and this scale Y function will increase the height by 50%. Let me show you the code for that. That's in the scaling demo. So same idea, we have a series of divs. Each div has a class, and in each case, I set the relevant transform function to be scale a smaller value than 1 to make it smaller, or scale a larger number than 1 to make it bigger, or two values to scale the X amount and the Y amount separately, and then to be specific, scale the X by 50% and the Y by 50% extra. Okay, so that's quite straightforward. Next up, we have rotations. Now with rotations, by default, rotations are performed about the center point of the shape. So you set the transform property to be rotate, and then you specify the angle. A positive value means clockwise, and by default it will be performed about the center point of the shape, which is about here. If you specify a negative value, then obviously that translates anti-clockwise, and you can define the value in radians if you want to, like I've done here. And then just in this last example, two new things. When you call the transform property, you can specify a series of transformations, one after the other, separated by a space. So in this example, it's first of all moved the shape by 100 pixels to the right and 100 pixels down, and then it's rotated it by 10 degrees about the coordinate center. And I've also called another property called transform origin, which allows you to change the center of rotation, if you like. So in this example, the shape will be rotated about its top left-hand corner, which is here, rather than being rotated about the center point of the shape here, which would have been the default. So let's have a look at the code for that one. Rotations.html. So we have a series of divs with different classes. The first example rotated 10 degrees clockwise or 10 degrees anti-clockwise, specifying the angle in radians. And in this example, this is how you set the transformation origin. You use the vendor extension properties MS transform origin or WebKit transform origin or MOS or O, and you specify where you want the origin to be. And you can either use keywords like left or right or top or bottom, or you can specify a percentage. For example, you could specify that you want the transformation origin to be 20% along the width of the shape, like so. I'll just put that back. Having moved the transformation origin, we then perform two transformations. We translate by 100 pixels to the right and down, and then we rotate the shape about its center point by 10 degrees. Okay, one final example, and that's skewing. With skewing, there's a skew function which allows you to make the shape slanty. The skew function, by default, can take one value, which will skew the shape by 30 degrees anti-clockwise. This time it's different than rotations. A positive value here will skew anti-clockwise 30 degrees about the x-axis. This one will rotate 30 degrees clockwise about the x-axis, and again you can specify the value in radians if you want to. And if you really want to, you can skew about both axes. So this will skew the shape 15 degrees anti-clockwise about the x-axis, and then 15 degrees anti-clockwise about the y-axis. I find that looks quite odd, but maybe you have just the thing that would need this capability. And then just to finish off, there's a skew x function and a skew y function if you want to be specific about the axis. So let's just briefly have a look at the code for that. So we have a series of divs that have different classes, skew1, skew2, and so on. And in each case, we perform a transformation using the skew function to skew anti-clockwise by 30 degrees or clockwise by 30 degrees, specifying radians if we want to, and then finally allowing us to specify two different values or just one value using the skew x and the skew y functions separately. So that's the end of this lesson. We've seen how you can perform transformations by setting the transform property, either to use translations, like so, or scaling via the scale function, or rotations via the rotate function, or, if you want to, using skewing via the skew function.